the emphasis on the need of story to inform and shape us and to help and guide us, that's in Phantastes, is here in Lilith. But what's even stronger is in Lilith is learning to act out what is learned from the story,
Right.
not just to have those stories, but to act them out. So in that sense, it's a more thorough exploration of the futility of noble thought without noble action. Like we really see that. And that the more explicit journey towards the acceptance of death to self cannot be made in isolation. Like that's really clear in this story is we're hopeless trying to do it on ourselves. We just can't.
Right.
So we have Fane, Vane, wandering in a lost wood, like Dante, a wood somehow accessed without ever walking outside his own house. And he says, what a hell of horror to wander alone, a bare existence never going out of itself, never widening in its life in another life, but bound within the cords of its poor peculiarities, lying an eternal prisoner in the dungeon of its own being. I had never had a bosom friend. I had regarded with wonder my past self, which preferred the company of book or pen to that of man or woman. I had chosen the dead rather than the living, the thing thought rather than the thing thinking. Any man, I said now, is more than the greatest of books.
Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holser. I'm your host, Derek. The Plunge is conversations around theology, philosophy, and culture, and it's done in a thematic series format, so we have multiple conversations on the same topic. This is episode 2 on the novel Lilith, George MacDonald's tale of life through death. And I'm very excited for this episode because joining me for this conversation is Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson, a George MacDonald scholar who lives on a farm in the Ottawa Valley, Canada. She writes and lectures internationally on George MacDonald, the Inklings, the 19th century, and faith and the arts. She's also on the advisory board of the Inklings Journal 7. She is a founding member of the C.S. Lewis and Kindreds Society of Eastern and Central Europe. And Kirstin is the co-chair of the George MacDonald Society. She directs LILITH, a theology and arts conference and lecture series based in rural Ontario. Kirstin is passionate about integrating ecological care, local community, and academia, and she occasionally partners with the environmental network of Arosha. You can find some of her photography on Instagram at hashtag mythopoeic_life. That's mythopoeic_life. I think you'll find this conversation with Kirstin to be refreshing, insightful, encouraging, and hopeful. And I think you're going to love it. So, ladies and gentlemen, my conversation with Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson on Lilith, George MacDonald's tale of life through death. It's so good to be here with Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson. I'm so grateful for her time and expertise. And if you don't mind, Kirstin, would you just share a little bit of your background, and then we'll jump into a conversation about George MacDonald, Lilith, Dante, and other fun things.
Thank you so much, Derek. And it's really fun and a privilege to be here. Thank you. I am a Canadian farm kid and literature academic, George MacDonald scholar, who has come full circle after doing degrees in literature and theology. I ended up doing my PhD in St. Andrews on George MacDonald at the Institute of Theology, Imagination, and the Arts with Trevor Hart, and now find myself back in the Ottawa Valley where I grew up on a farm. And I teach and write independently from here, travel out to do that as well as doing it online. And then I also host a lot of events on my farm. I'm the director of a nonprofit called Windstone Farm Linlassen, which seeks to cultivate community through theology, ecology, and the arts, being very rooted in place, engaging with the people who live in this neighborhood and area, as well as inviting others from abroad into that. So we have events. We host events with people like Trevor Hart and Malcolm Guite and Shad and Steve Prince, a real mix of different theologians and artists and people who love the land. And we also spend a lot of time working on restoration of the land. And all those things are integrated. And that's very George MacDonald-esque to integrate all of those things.
Yes. Oh, that's beautiful work. Well, I look forward to visiting the farm at some point because it just looks amazing. Yeah. Well, I'm going to jump into our first question. And you've just finished a conference at Wheaton regarding the fact that George MacDonald was born 200 years ago. We're recording this June 11th, 2024. And George was born in 1824. And I'm curious, when you think about the time in which he came of age and the times which we have today, what aspects of culture, education, and religion do you suppose are similar?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Not least as it keeps striking me this year as I'm involved in so many different conversations and interviews and discussions and conferences, how much resonance there is between MacDonald's time and our own. The world changed so dramatically during MacDonald's lifetime and so rapidly. When he was born, London was well over a week's trip away from his home. It's a long ways away from where he lived, regardless of your mode of transport. In his youth, steamboats sped that trip up to about 4 days when he was a teenager. By the time he was into his career, he could train right to his hometown. Train lines are laid down, and there's a train that went right by his farm. So things that way changed dramatically. Telegraphs, later telephones, became available during his lifetime. And I hope you're hearing some resonances with some of the changes during, say, my lifetime. MacDonald began writing all of his manuscripts longhand, but in his later years, he wrote on the fancy invention called the typewriter. He even in his elder years experimented with the new transportation device called a tricycle. Social mores, what was acceptable in polite society, also changed dramatically, whether in terms of topics of conversation, attire, even forms of entertainment. Issues of nationalism and immigration were causing great debate during MacDonald's lifetime. Celebrityism was on the rise. Housing, land rights issues were rife. And Romanticism was just one of the pushbacks against industrialization, realism, progressivism. Mechanization was rendering obsolete occupations that had been in families for generations. Again, like so much resonance. Mechanization was also making available things to most of the populace that had only been available once to the rich. So much of this is exactly the type of shifting and changing and the rapidity of it that we are seeing today. Yeah.
Yes.
I think there may have been, not everybody might agree with me, but it seems to me that there may have been a greater sense of optimism amongst the middle and upper classes during that time than perhaps there is for us today. But it certainly was a dire time for the lower classes, especially with the urbanization, the effects of urbanization. There's a loss of cultural and religious identity from the move from rural long-term communities. There was also a growing freedom to openly question one's religious identity. And so there's some very public deconstruction of religiosity going on very publicly in the culture. And I could continue with the resonances, but even with this wee bit, I think one can see why MacDonald's concerns about so many of these issues lends a particular relevance to the challenges that might face us today. And being aware of these contexts into which MacDonald is writing, I think it helps us as readers see how contemporary his writing is. You know, he might be pulling Shakespeare and Chaucer and Plato into a text, but as he does so, he's using their insights to illuminate questions very relevant to his contemporary readers. Eugenics, animal rights, abuse, depression, poverty laws, ecological damage, suffragism, immigration, racism, labor laws, and more. So MacDonald's taught me, isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
I find it really fascinating to stop in and think about. And so I really appreciate that question. And it's made me realize, just mulling over your questions, made me realize that how much MacDonald's taught me about how much the wise voices of the ages have to say to human challenges throughout time. Not just the voices of Scripture, though definitely those, but the assenting voices of all the ages. And that's how much they have to say for issues in our time today, the 21st century, that might resonate with MacDonald's 19th century, or that may seem entirely new to us. And I think that's also challenged me in my own work, be it more artistic or more academic. And you move into that realm yourself too, both the artistic, the fictional writing, say, and the academic. For me, MacDonald's stance, the way he positions himself, has challenged me to be more attentive to the distinctive expressions of needs and cries of my current age. So this 19th century guy has really pushed me to think more about that personally. And he is such an amazing mentor and model in this, because he doesn't just respond in his written work or in his presented art, but in his relationships, in his daily actions, in how he lives out his life in his immediate and wider community. And so MacDonald really challenges me personally in that, not just to have it academically or artistically, but in my praxis.
Yeah, well, it strikes me that, like all of the sort of, as you say, the great ascending voices throughout the ages, he is not distracted by, but also he has a healthy respect for the external symptoms and manifestations of the deeper issues, right? It's not about the inventions that change the way we live. It's the opportunity and access that people have. And so throughout, regardless of whether it's today us with the internet and airplanes, or him with, as you mentioned, steam engines and urbanization, right? It's continuing to recognize human dignity needs to be at the forefront and at the core of living in the manner that we're called to live. And that's why I think that has such resonance. So thank you. My next question, and this is a personal one, so thank you for entertaining it. MacDonald's biography, like most people who become iconic, is easily oversimplified. And so in my own experience early on, I fell prey to the idea and the concept that he was the upbringing of this very staunch Calvinist environment. And of course, that resonated in my own life because I grew up in an independent fundamentalist environment, and with legalism very prevalent. And yet, in listening to you, actually, in the last year or two, I don't recall the timing, but I heard you sharing on YouTube regarding, actually, it's quite different than that, and he had a much broader background. So I'm just curious if you would add some color to that and any characterizations of his life that maybe we need to have corrected.
Yeah. I think somewhere in there you mentioned complex, and I think that's the reality. There's not a simple answer to what MacDonald's life looked like, and I think that's true of most of us, not all of us, but most of us, that we have many different influences that we look back and see as positive or negative. And it was brilliant at the conference I was just at to see and hear how much the understanding and perspective of MacDonald's biography has changed to a much more accurate biography, and to hear papers on, say, MacDonald and Calvin and MacDonald and Calvinism, and parsing out the differences and where MacDonald actually agrees with Calvin and where he agrees with certain aspects of Calvinism, but where he's really pushing back against others, particularly federal Calvinism. And just a more nuanced parsing out of those things. And I think I feel very defensive in some ways of MacDonald's grandmother, who is that character who shows up in Robert Falconer, who represents federal Calvinism and all the legalism and all the rules and the contracts versus covenants. And she's the one who burns the violin in a story. And that character is based on MacDonald's own paternal grandmother, who is adequately reflected from what we can understand by that character. And she actually burned MacDonald's grandfather's fiddle when she was concerned that her sons were getting too caught up with it. But as you've heard me say, first and foremost, I want to point out that isn't the house that MacDonald grew up in. He grew up in his father and uncle's household, who themselves were reacting against their mother. So, understandably, a very different household, a very open household, a very ecumenical household that encouraged dialogue and debate and difference and encouraged frolicking and fun and the arts. But back to my being defensive a little bit of MacDonald's grandmother, in Robert Falconer, the book itself, MacDonald says to us as a reader, he says, Miss St. John, who you as readers, who we all think of as an angel, the saving angel in the story, actually really makes a big mistake by setting up herself in a position of enmity against the grandmother. And she sees the grandmother's faults, but she doesn't see all her beautiful strengths. She doesn't see the deep love she holds for Robert and for Shagar, and the fact that she's giving her entire life over to care for these orphans. And that even though it's caught up in legalism, her heart is constantly breaking for her son, who does not know the Lord. She's not approaching it what we would think is theologically wise or well, but she loves so deeply that she is racked by her love. And I really like how MacDonald tries to remind us of this, that he may disagree with her theology very deeply. He may abhor aspects of her theology, but not all aspects of her theology, and definitely not her as a person.
Yeah.
And MacDonald's really wanting us to push back against anything that encourages us into schism. And his son even his son Ronald says a couple places, that was my father's biggest strive, was to bring the church back into unity. And MacDonald talks about throwing his one pebble against the great Sabbath breaker schism. And so I love that MacDonald is helping people heal from true trauma and damage, from church pain, theological abuse, theological trauma. But he doesn't want us to then reflect the problem or contribute to the problem. He's calling us to love, to try to rebuild unity, to rebuild relationship, to heal division. And I think sometimes in the responses to trauma, we're not actually building relationship. We're just, and sometimes we have to step back, right? That's an important part of healing. But MacDonald's encouraging us not to set up others as demons.
So good.
And so I think that's one of the really big things with MacDonald that it's important for us to remember and see. But also he's sometimes set up as being anti-science, which he wasn't at all. He actually originally wanted to be either a mathematician, a doctor, or a scientist. All his scholarships in school, the awards he won were in the science fields and natural philosophy. And he was even invited to study with a famous scientist in Edinburgh. And he really wanted to do agricultural chemistry to help fight some of the social ills, poverty issues in his time. And in Lilith, he plays with concepts of refraction and reflection and spectrum. You start to look for science in MacDonald, you realize it is everywhere. He's deeply in love with science. He's also exceedingly playful. And I think sometimes if we start thinking about theology, we don't think of theology as a playful thing, but even if we read his theology well, we see that he's constantly reminding us that God calls us to be playfellows with him, that we're called into childlikeness. And when you look at stories from his own family, you see that again and again, dressing up with friends like a bear to tease the children, or hosting plays in his backyard with picnics and dances and getting people who are completely different social classes to dance with each other and play with each other.
Yes.
And yeah, I don't want to go on too much about that because there's so many things. But yeah, he's a storyteller from the beginning.
Yeah.
Maybe this last little vignette ties us back to the understanding his push against bad theology and maybe cruel theology. He grew up in this quite diverse, ecumenically diverse family and arguably culture, but a culture that did have a lot of the federal Calvinism and repressive Calvinism in it. And when he was quite young at school, his school teacher would force the children to recite the Westminster Confession. And if they made mistakes, he would whip them. And he whipped MacDonald's younger brother so badly that he was in bed for days, and some people posit that that actually led to the young boy's death. He died not long afterwards. And so that also helps us understand some of his violence
Sure.
against that. That's not love of God.
No,
Well,
that as MacDonald would say, that's as he would say, that's not of love's kind, right? Not at all.
not.
Yeah.
And it's important to know that MacDonald's father was part of the movement to quickly replace that school teacher with a school teacher who was beautiful and loving and really fostered MacDonald's own storytelling, who himself told stories about MacDonald, telling ghost stories and folk stories to fellow pupils. And he really encouraged MacDonald in both his faith and his writing, as did MacDonald's minister at the time. MacDonald talks about how much he loved his minister.
Yeah.
It's nothing's ever simplex.
No. And I often remark, for me, MacDonald, one of the most striking things is he, like most of us, will give lip service to the idea that we're supposed to be childlike, but he like fully believed it and fully demonstrated it, right? And it's a remarkable gift and light to light the way for us. I want to jump into a question connected to one of MacDonald's proteges through time, Mr. C.S. Lewis, who for many of us in the evangelical tradition, especially in America, C.S. Lewis is the gateway to MacDonald. I came across MacDonald because of the effusive praise that Lewis gave him and the anthology he produced of his excerpts. But Lewis uses a word that is not common, and certainly most of us have never heard it before unless we're involved in these scholarly pursuits such as yourself. And that word is mythopoetic. What is mythopoetic, and are there any modern examples?
Yeah, it's a complicated word, and there's even different versions of the word or ways to use the word. So mythopoeic, mythopoetic, mythopoesis. Tolkien has his poem Mythopoeia, which ties into Lewis's understanding very much. And I think for me, this was part of my gateway actually to serious study of MacDonald. It was Lewis's use of the word in describing MacDonald that made me want to write my PhD on MacDonald.
Wow.
But in his anthology, Lewis writes that there is one art that might rate above all others, he says, and it is mythopoesis. And he adds it was this mythopoeic art. So after he says it's like he thinks possibly the greatest of all the arts, then he not only says that MacDonald excels in this art, but he goes further and says that MacDonald's actually the greatest genius in what may be one of the greatest arts. So it's a pretty high, it's a crazily high accolade.
Yes.
And so I wanted to dive further into this when I read that, when I came back and reread the anthology and some of Lewis's essays as a young adult. And mythopoeic is a word and a concept of which Tolkien and Lewis and others like Auden thought highly, but they also used in print rather sparingly. So even they themselves did not use the word often. But I would argue they use it sparingly because they assented that there are too few works which deserve the adjective. And definitely culturally today we use the word much more easily than they do. After having learned from them, I think I might even use the word more easily than they do. But MacDonald is one of the few people to whom they attribute that term. Auden also attributes it to MacDonald. And usually if one does run across the term, it's slapped on the back of a fantasy novel, right?
Uh-huh.
As if anything that sort of, resonant of Narnia or Middle Earth is therefore mythopoeic. But in my close reading of Lewis and Tolkien, it became clear that for them the word meant more than just fantastical myth-making. It's really an important term. Lewis is clear that the mythopoeic needn't even be fantastical, which kind of sort of pushes back at our thoughts about it a little bit. But it also became really clear to me that for them, the word held theological import. So when I realized that, I decided to spend several years of my life trying to figure out what they meant by the term and whether MacDonald was intentionally seeking to be this sort of writer. And if so, what shaped him into being the person who intentionally sought to craft mythopoeic writing? So my best answer to your question takes a whole doctoral dissertation. I'll be a little bit more brief here. But I do think it's a really important question for the course that you're doing because the concept really sheds significant light upon the text of Lilith itself and what MacDonald's doing there. And if I'm correct, you might be doing a later series on Owen Barfield.
Yes, we are.
Possibly. And Barfield is another MacDonaldite. And he is really significant in shaping Lewis and Tolkien's understanding of the concept. So for those who want to dive deeper, I pull all three of them into a chapter called George MacDonald and Mythopoesis in the book The Inklings and Culture, which is edited by Monica Hilder and Sarah.
Wonderful.
If you want to dive deep into that, you can. But okay, so here's like my attempt to do it as brief as possible. If you go to the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll discover that it defines mythopoeic as myth making, productive of myths, pertaining to the creation of myths. Often you'll hear, when you read of it in books, people just shorten that to literary myths. What does that mean? The word myth itself has so many different definitions, right? And we use it, even our common parlance, in so many different ways. Yes. So in short, Tolkien and Lewis agree that a myth is a story out of which ever varying meanings will grow for different recipients in different ages. A story out of which ever varying meanings will grow for different recipients in across the ages.
Wow.
And that's why, and this continues to be true in the academy today, they use, the word is used, Tolkien and Lewis use the word, it's often when you're studying concepts of myth, the word is used for both factual and fictive tales.
Okay.
Because factual tales can also do the same thing, right?
Sure.
And I'm sure, Derek, you know about the pivotal conversation that Lewis and Dyson and Tolkien had on Addison's Walk.
Yes.
In which Tolkien and Dyson explained to Lewis that the uniqueness of the Christian myth is that God as author had used images that were precise in location, in history, and in consequence. That the old myth of a dying God had become fact. So that it's myth doesn't mean that it's factual. That it's myth means that it has this strength across time and this depth, which can be true of something that's fictive or factual. And the gospel is factual in their understanding. Lewis later wrote, by becoming fact, it does not cease to be myth. That is the miracle.
That's good.
So that's so beautiful. So it is still, even though it's factual, it is still a story out of which ever varying meanings will grow for different recipients in different ages. And so they actually call the gospel the truest myth.
Yes.
I think it's helpful for us to know that once Lewis had changed his mind about the truth of the Christ story, he wrote that what he found so astounding was that, again, I'll quote Lewis here, but this is just reiterating what I've said, that by becoming fact, it does not cease to be myth. That is the miracle. Even though the gospel is true, yet it remains a story that changes lives, no matter what the century or country is in which it is told.
Wow.
So there's no guarantee that the story will change lives, the lives of those who come to know the story, but there's definitely something within the story that can do that and has done that for many. And understanding this, thinking of it in terms of the gospel being the truest myth, the greatest mythopoeic tale, I think really helps us better understand the word mythopoesis or the term mythopoeic, that in their terms, a mythopoeic story is one that has this timeless, ageless transformation possible element within it. So there's something within the story that has the potential, no guarantee, but the potential to somehow transform something within the reader, something that's not bound to time or place, but somehow bigger. Whether that's because, we've met ants We see trees differently. That's a
Right.
small change, but an important change within us.
Yeah.
Hobbits help us understand heroism in a different way. And reading the Gospel of Christ can
Yes.
totally transform the way we see the entire world, right? So
Right.
it can be in little ways or big ways.
Hmm.
So, of course, the big question for me was, how does one craft a story that's mythopoetic?
Right. Can you even do it intentionally?
Yeah, and can you do it intentionally? So that's the real big question, right? Was MacDonald doing it intentionally? And I mean, super short, yes. He's very intentional. Does he achieve it always? Maybe not always, but is he trying to? Yes. So he's repeatedly taught in his life from his childhood, from his grandmother, from his uncles, from his father and his great uncles. He's repeatedly taught through his life, and then teaches and models himself that great story is born out of great story, out of intentional engagement with great story.
Right.
So stories are expressions of relationship. The stories call us into relationship with the characters.
Yeah.
They impel us into relationship with others. And of course, the greatest story, that truest myth, is a story about perfect relationship embodied.
Right. Wow.
So part of what pulls us into that very story of perfect relationship embodied, and we forget this too often, I think, today, part of what pulls us into that story, helps us understand that Christ story, is that it's a story that is itself pulling into itself all the stories that have come before, the Old Testament stories, Christ's fulfillment of the Old Testament stories. Those stories help us better understand the Christ story, right?
Yes.
That pulling in of other stories is key to helping us understand what is happening and how we're a part of it. And so for MacDonald, he really intentionally engages with this. He also shows and teaches that the more intentionally we engage with the stories of the past, written stories and oral stories, the more intentionally we learn from them, converse with them, seek to be shaped by them, seek to be shaped by the stories that have gone before us, the greater will be the inherent element of relationship within the stories that we craft. The more layered and rich the truths will be, and thus the more likely that they will be mythopoetic. And so I think I know MacDonald's very intentional. He gets this, he's taught this, and then he seeks to participate in that. And I think Lewis and Tolkien saw that in him. To enter that long conversation.
So good. I appreciate that, Kirstin. That's very, very illuminating. And we'll be sure to provide everyone with the link to that book as well that you referenced. Really appreciate it. I want to turn to Lilith and Dante. There's a newer copy of Lilith that's illustrated, produced by Jess Liederman and illustrated by Gabrielle, I believe it's Ragusi. And you wrote the introduction to that. And I really appreciate it because you reference a person who was influential on MacDonald that probably a lot of people aren't familiar with, and that's A.J. Scott. And so I was just curious if you could kind of depict the influence that A.J. Scott had on MacDonald.
Yeah, I'm a big A.J. Scott fan. And you're right, very few people know about him, which is tragic because especially any of us who've studied English literature should know all about him. And so I'm keen to tell you a bit of the A.J. Scott story. And again, understanding his story really helps us understand more deeply what MacDonald is doing, all of his work, but at Lilith in particular. I think it's fair to say he's really the godfather of any of us who teach or study English literature, because he's the first ever full-time English literature professor, which is so cool. And MacDonald actually calls him his master.
Okay.
Why are we never told? It is so ironic that in this discipline of stories, we don't know our own story. And I think for Christians especially, this can be a really encouraging story to know when you're in the English literature departments. MacDonald calls Scott his master, much the same way as Lewis calls MacDonald his master. He specifically says that Scott is his greatest influence other than his own father. So this guy is...
Yeah.
Scott's a rather amazing character. And so I get almost as excited talking about Scott as I do George MacDonald. In the 1840s, George MacDonald's a young seminarian in London, and he's really dissatisfied by the limits of what's being taught in his classes. He actually offers tutorials on the side on chemistry himself and teaches his colleagues chemistry because, as a good future pastor, you should know your chemistry. But he also drags a bunch of his fellow students off to some public lectures that are being given by this fellow Scotsman that he's heard about named A.J. Scott. Mm. And Scott's a really curious figure in the London scene. He's a generation older than MacDonald. He'd immigrated down to England to pastor Scottish expats, but found himself more than a little disturbed, I think is a fair enough word to use, when learning how restricted education was in this new country. London had become the largest city in the world. So you imagine, it is the largest city in the world at the time. The Industrial Revolution is wreaking havoc on people's communal identities. Mm-hmm. It's pulling them away not only from their cultural stories and parish communities, their family stories, they're often the scripture stories because they're being pulled out of their church communities, but also, and this is something that I didn't realize till I started to study MacDonald, literacy rates in England were at least 20% lower than in Scotland.
Wow.
For men and women both.
Wow.
Which means there's also little literature being read in England. But what's also really crazy is that it wasn't just the lower classes who didn't know Chaucer, Sidney, Shakespeare. You think, everybody's going to school and learning those things. Well, lower classes definitely aren't. They can't even read. But perhaps even more bizarrely to us today, many Oxford and Cambridge graduates weren't overly familiar with that literature either.
Interesting.
And this is, isn't it? It's so helpful to know our story. And lots of things start to make sense when we know our heritage better. And what I learned was that the literary focus at Oxford and Cambridge had traditionally been the classics. If the stories weren't in Greek or Latin, then they weren't considered material worthy for study.
Right.
And there's actually a group of students at Cambridge who were perturbed enough about this early in the 19th century that they started their own club that not only set readings for each other in English literature, but actually even set essays for each other because they really felt like they should know this. I can't imagine a bunch of students setting essays for each other as a club, but they did this.
Yeah.
And when similarly minded folk discovered that H.A. Scott had begun offering free evening lectures on English literature, English church history, English philosophy for the dock workers in his parish, because he was appalled that they hadn't had these opportunities like this dock workers in Scotland would have had. But when his educated friends and educated people, Oxbridge people, learned that he was giving these lectures, they begged him to broaden his audience and offer similar talks in public lecture halls as well. And so the likes of Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, F.D. Morris, who'd been one of those Cambridge students setting papers for each other, the Wedgwoods, these people all began to attend, and they were captivated by Scott's lectures. Scott was actually going down to the archives of the British Library, and he's pulling up dusty tomes with names like Beowulf, Piers Plowman, the Pearl. Nobody had heard of these things, and he was pulling them up and
oh my goodness,
seeing his audiences, his English audiences, Scott introducing his English audiences to these important English texts.
Wow.
And he's both inviting them in, but he's also chastising his educated peers for being intrigued with even continental literature. Some of the German literature was kind of trendy at the time, but they're disregarding their own English literature. And this is early in the century. So this, the change, there's a pivot, and Scott's really key in this pivot that happens during the century. It's hard for us to imagine today, but when you read Scott's lectures, you see that he's actually arguing for the validity of studying Shakespeare and Chaucer and Milton. Like he's having to argue that this is a good thing to do.
Wow.
And it was to these lectures that the young MacDonald was dragging his friends. To hear a Scotsman rather brilliantly teaching English literature to English audiences. I mean, sure, the young 20-something must have been delighted in that mere reality aside from the actual content. But by the time MacDonald's hearing Scott, Scott's conviction had become his career. He is by then the chair of English language and literature in University College as the first ever full-time English literature professor. F.D. Morris had preceded him in navigating the position part-time. Impacted by Scott's lectures, he had decided he wanted to put time into this. So really between the two of them, they carve and shape out this new discipline. And they're two of MacDonald's key influences. MacDonald named Scott, Morris, and Ruskin as amongst his closest and most influential friends.
Right.
What's really interesting to us is that Scott and Morris are very intentionally Trinitarian. Morris was actually raised in a Unitarian household. His dad was a Unitarian pastor. So he's been really intentional in his shift to Trinitarian theology. And what's kind of cool is that this is what informs their Trinitarian theology, is what informs their conviction that the stories we imbibe shape who we are, how we relate with each other and with God, as does our lack of story and our lack of identity. So these guys, this back to relationality, these guys believe that's within the space of a story, as modeled by Scripture itself, readers can be changed, even transformed. There's that mythopoet concept, right? Literature that was shaped by, responded to, engaged with Scripture could be, as Lewis calls it, MacDonald's novel Fantastes, preparatio evangelica. They can be, they can prepare the way for the good news for us. But they also believe that careful reading, whether it's actually does lead to an acceptance of the gospel or not, it was just simple fact that careful reading could help any human to be more empathetic and sympathetic, and is important for that in and of itself.
Yeah.
Good reading of good literature could foster hospitable listening, reorientation in attitudes. Interestingly, these guys are living in an age of swelling nationalism. Like, this is the empire, right? And they talk about, they're very specific and explicit in the fact that they believe that better knowing England's stories will actually help the English understand that so much of the richness of their identity was born out of engagement with and through the influence of other cultures. So the better we know ourselves, the better we understand how others
interconnected we all are. Right.
Yeah. So to better know one's own stories, to better understand how richly entwined it is with the stories of others.
Yeah.
I find it really interesting that Scott and Morris talk of literature as being a communication of living persons. So for them, engaging with literature was engaging with real eschatologically alive voices, which is so interesting to ponder. And this shaped their theological perspective that to know something of the author, of how a piece of work came about, is to understand that work better. And that's what you're inviting your students into right now.
Right.
Just like knowing something of God and the creation of the world is to understand creation better, that's true of written text as well. And they don't believe, and maybe this is helpful when studying a complicated text, they don't believe in an exclusively correct reading of a human text. But like they don't think any one of us can come up with this is everything you can get out of this text. This is exactly what it means. However, for them, the reader is never more important than the author. Instead, the reader's a participant in a conversation proffered by the author. And I think it's interesting that that's where the discipline started. It did a complete roundabout, and I think we're starting to find a way back again, remembering that it's not all about the reader. The author has written this to invite us into a conversation with the author.
Yeah. Well, sorry. It makes me think of the way in which many of us have read the Scripture in my lifetime, in that it's reader focused, right? And individual interpretation, etc. So anyway, please continue.
Yeah, no community, and we kind of stand over the text rather than under the text.
Right.
Yeah, and that lack of humility, which is so important. And F.D. Morris talks a lot about the humility of the literary critic and how we should approach the text. If we're going to critique a text, we need to do it in companionship with the Holy Spirit. Again, I think like even some of my own early literary criticism, had I done that, had that approach, I probably would have written some of my critiques a little differently. Yeah.
Can I jump to my next question, or did you have something else?
You definitely.
Okay. Well, again,
Yeah, I think just. Yeah.
we're in the same vein, but I mentioned this to you, and I mean this sincerely. Your introduction in that copy of Lilith is so well done. I wish that it was inserted into the front of every Lilith publication, because as you know, and as we've experienced, for the newcomer to MacDonald, particularly Lilith, is it can be intimidating, confusing, perplexing, right? And many people will abandon it before really giving it the opportunity to hear what it has to say. So your introduction creates an even deeper and richer understanding of, as you mentioned, getting to know the author and understanding that in the context of the work. But you wrote that Scott, as we mentioned, A.J. Scott, who MacDonald calls his master, is one of the most admired Dante scholars of his day. And Lilith has numerous Dante-esque elements, which likely comprise, a full year's worth of discussions. But where in our limited time would you say there's commonalities between the Divine Comedy and Lilith, and where does MacDonald depart from Dante, if any?
Yeah. Yeah. This is it's a really important question. It's a really big question. So I might here do a bit of a deep dive, and I'm aware that some of your students probably don't know Dante that well. So if it's okay with you, I might just give a little bit of picture of what's going on in the Commedia, because I think that will help too in this. Yeah, and obviously feel free to interpose at any point in time. But yeah, MacDonald followed Scott's lead, and he gave many lectures on Dante, not only in England, but in Scotland, Ireland, and Italy. I find it really fascinating. It took him a long time to feel ready to do that. He didn't start lecturing on Dante until his 50s. So he spent a lot of time with Dante, and by that time he can even quote entire passages by heart, in Italian and in English from Dante. And MacDonald, who was, becomes, for 40 years, he's a literature teacher himself. He only ever teaches on British authors, with the exception of Dante. Dante's the only exception to that.
Oh.
And I think that the relationality of Dante, what Dante teaches and does, is part of this reason. And that's why I want to spend a bunch of time, because I think, this text has more than just Dante-esque elements to it. MacDonald references Dante throughout his entire corpus. At least 20-some books specifically mention Dante. His sermons are constantly referencing Dante. But I'd say that Dante's actually, aside from Scripture, the most significant text of influence upon Lilith.
Okay.
So you will still enjoy Lilith if you haven't yet read Dante. But after you read Lilith and then go off and read the Commedia, Dante's Commedia, and then come back, you will have so much fun. Let's see. Yeah, in a sense, Lilith is really almost a type of conversation with the comedy. So it's not like there's influences is maybe not sufficient. He's engaging with ideas. In early manuscripts of Lilith, MacDonald has explicit Dante references everywhere. But by the time he gets to his final manuscript, his final typed manuscript, he's whittled those down to 3 explicit mentionings of Dante. But there's allusions everywhere. So here's my quick overview of Dante, sort of set up in a way, or of the Commedia, Dante's Commedia, in a way that's hopefully those of you who've read the text of Lilith, will start to hear resonances just as I give you the quick version of the Commedia. So the story begins with Dante coming to himself in the woods, where he's rescued from the threat of a leopard, a lion, and a wolf. And he's rescued by the classic poet Virgil. And Virgil explains that Santa Lucia, the patron saint of light and sight and vision, has sent Beatrice, Dante's love Beatrice, to him, asking that on behalf of Mary, who weeps with bright beaming eyes. I'm hoping some of you are catching some resonances already. Mary, who weeps with bright beaming eyes, has asked that Virgil intervene in Dante's life by guiding him through hell and purgatory. The choice of Virgil as an escort is important because it indicates a specific guidance by the literature of others. And indeed, that's true throughout the entire Commedia, right? That's a key point, obviously, for Scott and MacDonald. The Commedia is expressly intertextual. It's constantly engaging with scripture, myth, and history, contemporary history. And it's also worth noting that the Queen of Heaven, Mary, the person she chooses to expose redemptive truth, is Virgil, a poet of pagan myth. So Dante the Pilgrim follows his guide. He learns consequences of various sins. Eventually, they come to the deepest level of hell, where all the inhabitants are not in flaming fire. No, they are frozen in ice, in increasing isolation, culminating in the glacial Satan, who in utter isolation sustains that state of all things being frozen and apart. There is no relationship in the depths of hell. From there, the two poets climb up to anti-purgatory, and then Dante is conveyed to purgatory proper by Saint Lucia. So in his dreams, he believes the usher to be an eagle. And again, pick up that eagle there. As he sojourns the 7 terraces of purgatory, Dante learns that the shadowless shades he meets there are being purged so that they might pass up to heaven, each penance relating directly to the sin that's weighted down the penitent. In the middle canto, in the very center of the Commedia, Dante comes to the realization that poetic imagination and divine love are together guiding him into salvific vision, guiding him into light. So he continues upwards. Virgil escorts Dante to the skirts of paradise, from whence he's guided by Beatrice, and finally by the theologian of love, Bernard, into the very heart of heaven. And, if you got a student who wants to do a paper on Lilith and St. Bernard, there is so much cool stuff there. Dante's comprehension of love and light and the joys of those communing in the spheres increases with each circle he passes through. And at the very zenith, he is granted vision of the fiery rose, in which the concentric petals and their glowing occupants interweave in a constant dance of the joy and light and glory of love, culminating in the revolving, co-inhering circles of the Trinity. So the utter separation and isolation of hell, to which Dante was first exposed, is contrasted with the utter relationality and communion of heaven. Bernard petitions Mary to enable Dante's vision, to remove the mortal clouding which impairs. And in that final beatific vision, Dante apprehends 2 revelations. First, he realizes that in divine light, the form or exemplar of all creation, all things are bound together. It's relationality again, right? Next, he beholds the Creator, one circle reflecting from the other, the third like a flame emanating from both. And when the circle of what he calls mirrored light, say it again, mirrored light, shows itself in the human form, Dante struggles to understand what he's seeing until a ray of divine light floods his mind with ineffable comprehension. He can't give words to it. But no longer through a mirror dimly, he is now seen face to face. And he sees that all creation and all time are bound up like the pages in a volume in God. All creation and all time are bound up like the pages in a volume in God. Thus, when Dante the exile finds his true home, that's how he finds his true home. In him, in whom I live and move and have my being. What Dante calls in the Commedia the high fantasy, that's Dante's phrase. He says the high fantasy then ends, and he surrenders his will and desire to the love that moves the sun and other stars. Then he's left back to our dimension again, to remember, yearn, and communicate with others the transforming vision. He mourns his having to leave, but he recognizes that this is his calling. And I give you this outline, which perhaps you've already seen, Derek. I think I've been able to see your noddings there. You're seeing resonances there. So many of the difficult passages in Lilith become more clear.
ma-
And were you picking up things there?
oh, of course, that makes tremendous sense. And the interplay is so much apparent as you illuminate that for us.
Yeah, and so I wanted to take the time to go through just the story there because I think that's really helpful. And I'll parse out some of the similarities and differences now, but having that story in our head really helps.
Very much so.
And think of even how the story begins with Vane discussing crossing the threshold into another world. I went out into the wood at once to resume my journey. Already we're hearing those resonances,
Yes.
right? And another point, Mr. Vane, being lost, sees a wood of tall, slender pine trees, and he turns towards it, but then he stumbles and falls. And then again, at some point, he's fleeing a large wild feline, like Dante's feline, and he falls. And then he says that at the top of the great stair did I come to myself. So MacDonald's he's even not just symbols and images, he's using very Dantean language here.
Very explicit.
So explicit, like it's not hidden. And actually, when I began my academic work on MacDonald, I knew scholars who would say, "Oh, there's not really much Dante there," and "Oh, maybe he does refer to Dante here or there." But if you stop and look, it is the framework of the text. Dante's vision of heaven is one of complete communion, utter relationship, and it's clear throughout Lilith that MacDonald is concurring with Dante that one's divine ascent or descent, up to that rose of full communion down to that frozen hell, is directly affected by one's interaction with other people, with others.
Mm-hmm.
And that true communion is enabled only through willing relationship with God. And so it's really important, and a bit of an ouch for some of us, that MacDonald establishes from the outset that Vane, the protagonist of Lilith, is a solitary scholar.
Yeah. Yes.
He spends too much time in his library. He's an isolated, orphaned Oxford student, alone in a vast house full of ancient books. And the journey ahead of him is going to help him develop a practiced understanding of relationship outside of his books.
Mm.
He's going to have to learn to participate in relationship maturely and selflessly.
Mm-hmm.
And as he struggles in both apprehension and perseverance, his pilgrimage is highlighted by the stories that surround him, just like Dante, the pilgrim, had learned so much from the stories. For instance, his Virgilian guide, Mr. Raven. So here is not Virgil, but it's Mr. Raven. But Mr. Raven turns out to be that Adam who first learned that it is not good for man to be alone.
Yes.
The title character Lilith is, in accordance with Hebraic legend, Adam's first wife who had rejected what she considered the slaving chains of relationship. So this Vane is finding himself right in the midst of the first family, which is, of course, his family tree, his heritage. As he progresses, he begins to recognize that the character of Lilith actually has a similar struggle of his own, only with more depth, more profound. There's a lot of resonances. Really, their journeys are pretty dang similar. And you may notice as you read the story, as you go back through the story, that he frequently condemns Lilith for the very things that he has not yet conquered in himself.
100%. Yes.
Yeah. And first you're like, oh, come on, Vane. And then you go, oh, ouch. Stop.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what MacDonald is hoping we'll do, right?
Right.
So many of the characters and he meets are explicitly Dante-esque as he slowly progresses up towards an increasingly better understanding of the divine call to relationality. But unlike Dante, this is one of the differences. His guides are only with him occasionally. Like Virgil, he doesn't have someone holding his hand. And Dante the Pilgrim really has someone holding his hand all the time. It's largely Vane's fault that nobody is holding his hand. Like he's the one who turns away the help, right?
Right.
That does alter his journey from Dante in that the sins aren't merely observed by Vane, but he actually commits sins in this text. Dante doesn't do that, but or not explicitly, right? But Vane does commit sins. He suffers from the consequences of them and he repents of them within the text.
Right.
And we as readers journey through that with him, which I think is very effective. Like we walk that journey of transgression and repentance and redemption with Vane. And I think also that his guides show greater compassion for the fallen. than Dante's Virgil does. Ironically, because Virgil is not coming from heaven himself, but Vane's gods show more compassion and certainly greater hope.
Yes.
So MacDonald fills the journey with a cornucopia of symbols and allusions for various reasons. And, whilst I'm arguing here that Dante's Commedia is the most dominant text upon which Lilith hangs, there's obviously a myriad of other works that are engaging with conversing with those Dantean ideas. And again, that just underscores for us that MacDonald believes that the power of what's woven into a text is strong enough to convey meaning, even when we do not make all the multifaceted, cross-disciplinary, encyclopedic links. He believes that power is imbued through story, conversing with story, even if we don't get it all. This is evident even in such subtleties as the naming of characters. Like every one of his characters' names in all of his books, they all mean something. The names may appear simple, but if you start to look at them closely, they serve as weighty commentaries upon key themes. And so I'm going to step aside from Dante, but look right into closer to Mr. Vane and Lilith to give you an example of this. And sure. Derek, you and I have talked about, I think, what was one of my favorite sections and scenes too, the little ones in the bags. So fascinating. And we see MacDonald play with this here. So Mr. Vane, his first name is never given to us, right? He's always Mr. Vane. And much has been made in MacDonald studies about Mr. Vane's name being a homonym for one who's proud.
Sure.
And of course, it's also a homonym for devoid of meaning. Vanity, vanity, all those vanities. But those are homonyms. They're spelled differently, the same sound, but it's also explicitly with the same spelling, the word for weathercock. Something blown about in any direction by the wind.
Right.
And it's interesting that the Oxford English Dictionary, like we think of the cock on top of a building, right? That turns around. But the actual definition is an unstable or constantly changing person or thing. Apply not just to the thing on top of the roofs, but to people too.
Yeah.
And then what I found very interesting when I started delving into this word was that the alternative spelling for vain, a constantly changing person or thing, is fane, F-A-N-E. Now, the reason that's interesting is that's the name MacDonald gave to Mr. Vane in the earlier drafts. So clearly MacDonald was really intentional here. He's meaning, right? Also in MacDonald's time, so this is contextual understanding, MacDonald's day and age, the word feign was a very popular slang word used by those wishing to escape either an expected duty or participation in some event. So the Oxford English Dictionary, I'll just say OED, I won't trip over that so much. The OED explains that one would avoid responsibility by shouting out feign I. So interesting. Okay, feign, avoiding responsibility. Yeah, that resonates, right? But then the dictionary definition goes on to explain that in a lot of the games in the period, a boy could shout feign I to be rid of an obligation, or bags I, which meant the same thing. Just bag to secure an advantage. The word bags was a popular word used to assert a claim to an article or the right to act a certain way. If you wanted to act a way, you had a right to act that way, regardless of what others think. Say bags.
Okay.
Or bags not establish exemption from anything unpleasant. So when you know all this complexity, this is like one little word, all of a sudden we've got all sorts of light shed on the name of the greedy, self-indulging, and self-oriented giants to which the little ones first fear that vain fane belongs. Right. They're scared that fane is one of the bags. So we understand what the bags are a lot more deeply for spending time following MacDonald's etymological game.
Wow.
So back to the carefully, it's so much fun and so much crazy. And just like that one thing gives you an idea of how deep this, we really could spend a lifetime with this.
Yes.
But back to our very carefully named Mr. Vane, who reveals in his ruminations that he considered himself a self-sufficient character. He says to us, I preferred the company of books or pen to that of man or woman. He doesn't have any friends. He doesn't even have a lover. He is nobody. Even his family history, we're told, his family history, which is a key aspect of self-knowledge, is unknown to him.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So think of this in light of Dante's Hell, Purgatory, and Heaven. Our protagonist is complete self-imposed isolation. He's not in a healthy space. He is a solitary critter. Derek, have you read Phantastes?
I have.
Okay, you may remember that two of the dominant themes in Phantastes are nobleness of thought is nothing without nobleness of deed,
Mm-hmm.
and that to truly live, one must first die to oneself. Those are two of the key themes. And it's interesting because that, the book that was at the beginning of MacDonald's career, and here's one at the end, these are the same themes,
Totally.
but they almost become more intrinsic to the tale, right? Like those are also themes in Lilith. In Phantastes, you have the young scholar who we discover in Lilith is the ancestor of Mr. Vane.
Yes.
And we are told in the text eventually knew the way to the region of 7 dimensions. He's learning to act and live well. But there's not as strong an emphasis on the need of relationality as there is in Lilith.
Yeah.
And MacDonald in this later text really spends much more time. He's moving along in Phantastes, but here we're diving deeper into relationship.
Right. Kirstin, those are somewhere in the ballpark of 30 plus years apart. Is that right?
Yeah, the 50s and the 80s. Yeah, 30 plus. Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. Yeah, Phantastes being the first book length, first novel MacDonald publishes.
Yeah.
And Lilith not being the last, but almost being the last, right near the end. And they really kind of are bookends.
Yeah, and even as you mentioned, like drawing out more of his own lived experience at that point, right? Of what matters most, that sort of thought. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can even think of MacDonald like when he's younger. Yeah, I guess as he, through those 30 years, becoming increasingly aware of the danger of becoming isolated in intellectualism. Isolated generally from other people, but especially with his friends and himself, and how easy it is to just lock yourself away or get stuck in your books or your ideas and your work and forget that actually those need to be put aside and we need to live that out. And so we see that in a much stronger way in Lilith, the emphasis on the need of story to inform and shape us and to help and guide us, that's in Phantastes, is here in Lilith. But what's even stronger is in Lilith is learning to act out what is learned from the story, not just to have those stories, but to act them out. So in that sense, it's a more thorough exploration of the futility of noble thought without noble action. Like we really see that. And that the more explicit journey towards the acceptance of death to self cannot be made in isolation. Like that's really clear in this story is we're hopeless trying to do it on ourselves. We just can't.
Right.
So we have Vane wandering in a lost wood like Dante, a wood somehow accessed without ever walking outside his own house. And he says, what a hell of horror to wander alone, a bare existence never going out of itself, never widening in its life in another life, but bound within the cords of its poor peculiarities, lying an eternal prisoner in the dungeon of its own being. I had never had a bosom friend. I had regarded with wonder my past self, which preferred the company of book or pen to that of man or woman. I had chosen the dead rather than the living, the thing thought rather than the thing thinking. Any man, I said now, is more than the greatest of books. So it becomes clear that a significant part of why Vane is unable to know who he is far from being able to die from himself. As Mr. Raven keeps on trying to invite him into doing right, because he doesn't know anyone else. He's hitherto I've loved my books more than any other person. And his relational lack has even impaired his book learning because he doesn't understand that the authors he reads are calling him outwards. This ties into the sort of the in and out repetition that Mr. Raven keeps on pulling us into. Like he opines, he says to him, books are but dead bodies to you, and a library nothing but a catacomb.
Right.
books are supposed to be calling us into living. And that's a constant theme in MacDonald that I think really comes to crux in Lilith, that to stay only in the false safety of the world of the mind is to betray the texts that we read. It's to read in vain if every man is not greater than every book.
So good. Right.
A book is a door in, says Mr. Raven, and therefore a door out. And he's exasperated when he says, it's like, you do not, so many people do not see this. A text is not to be an acquisition. Do you remember how Vane has this manifested form right near the beginning when he's following this guiding light of one of the worms that Mr. Raven tosses into the air?
Yes.
And it becomes like a glowing bird butterfly and illuminates Vane's path, like it's doing good for him. But he becomes so absorbed in the beauty that at first a rock makes him stumble and then a stone makes him fall. Hardly subtle imagery for biblically literate Victorians. And then as the living light begins to descend into his open reach, and he feels like, he says, the treasure of the universe is giving itself to me, he longs to have it in his hands. And so he takes the light, he grasps it rather than receiving it open-handed.
Right.
And that instant, light goes out, and I don't know if you remember what it turns into.
A book, right?
A dead book.
Yeah.
And a dead book says, a dead book with boards outspread, like heavy in my hand.
Wow.
So that's a great example of some of MacDonald's Dantean intertextuality, because he's pulling in scenes from Purgatory there, where the prideful are weighted down by stones. And here's a quick quotation. "Oh, you Christians, arrogant, exhausted, wretched, whose intellects are sick and cannot see, who place your confidence in backward steps, do you not know that we are worms and born to form the angelic butterfly that soars without defenses?"
Yes.
So again, that line, that text really helps us see that Vane is sick. He's of stunted intellect. Despite his Oxford education, he himself is a dead book, bound between the safe covers of a literary life.
Well, and it makes me think of the way we can grasp the living word and attempt to bring it into just the mere pages of a text, right? And thus it's dead.
It's so much easier than dealing with humans, right?
Of course.
Like humans are so uncomfortable. They cause so much problems. It's so much safer. But that is I love MacDonald's pretty harsh. Like that's to betray the text.
Yes.
If you do that.
Well, we've got about 10 minutes left. So
okay.
What would you? I'll let you pick what you would like to draw on and send us home with.
Yeah. Okay. So do I do a little more of Dante? So why don't you help me? Because I'm not going to be able to decide.
Well, I'll say this.
Most funny.
Yeah. Professor Ron Dart is going to share more on Dante. He's part of this series.
Okay.
So I thought in particular, because your voice is so encouraging and also so grounded, for those introductory chapters, I curated a few quotes from those chapters and thought maybe you could guide us into a little deeper illumination for those who are just beginning to read this book. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good. And then you can choose which ones you want to keep or don't want to keep, etc.
Yeah, I think there's 3 that I want to touch on, and then we'll wrap it up with whatever final thoughts you have. Perfect.
Cool.
So this is we're in the beginning. There's a quote that I think is very interesting. Chapter 3, that the more doors you go out of, the further you get in. And I'm curious, because I tie it in then to chapter 4. To go back, you must go through yourself, and that way no man can show another. So there's this interplay of, I guess, what we perceive as entering, but it's actually exiting, and vice versa. And what are your thoughts on those?
Okay. So the more doors you go out of, the further you get in. I think it's helpful when we read that passage to remember that Vane has just re-entered Mr. Raven's place, the space and place of learning for him through a mirror. So this
Right.
time he's walked through a mirror. So he's walked through an instrument of self-reflection. And that space of self-reflection has brought him out of himself, which means it's brought him deeper into the place and space of learning, to truth. And I think throughout this text, we're looking at Mr. Raven's helping Mr. Vane see different ways of stepping in to look at yourself more closely, to understand yourself better so that you can go out, and going out so that you can come back in wiser and fuller, and more able to be in relationships. So books are doors out of self. A book is a door in, therefore a door out. And people, relationship, and stories also are deeper spaces of learning that we step into and learn more and step out. And he switches them up. It's not straightforward. You're like, okay, which is the door in and which is the door out? And I think each time you see that in the text, take time to look at what the portal has been. In this case, the fact that the portal is a mirror, I think, is very important because he has stepped through the mirror of self-reflection, therefore getting deeper into himself and understanding himself. And then he'll go back out, and then he'll come in through a book or through a space in the library shelf, and then step out. And so rather than parsing that out completely, I just want to challenge you guys as readers to start tracking in and out. And this, when we have the phrase to go back, you must go through yourself, and that way no man can show enough. I mean, this is what Vane is doing. This is what's happening in the story, right? Is that he's learning to self-reflect, not to become self-absorbed, but to look at himself and understand himself better, which he does by then going out into stories and engaging with others, hearing the stories of others, being attentive to others, which for the little ones, like that's a big thing for him, right? He wants to help and fix them, which is actually all about himself. And he has to stop and learn. He even realizes that even as he's doing it, it's like, this is actually partly about looking like a hero myself. And he ends up really damaging them by wanting to be the hero because he's not sufficiently self-reflective yet. And he's not paid enough attention to their story and not recognized their own need of learning because they need to learn and grow themselves. And so that going through himself is something that only he can learn. Nobody else can do that for him. And yet he also cannot do that outside of relationship.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it also connects toward the end of the story with the conversation with Lilith herself about there's a light deeper than your own will that lights up from behind it. And for our own journey, right, this is a direct application to us as human beings learning and growing, that going in, if we go deep enough, we will discover our true selves because the light of Christ at the deepest part of our hearts. So,
and yet we have to make sure that our focus doesn't stay.
Yes.
Or it will start to putrefy.
Right.
We need to go back out.
We're not allowed to become collapsing stars. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
This one in particular is personal. From chapter 6, this is a quote, because of my own journey of, I would say, being a little too performance oriented and like drive, do. This quote is fascinating. I believe it's Eve that says this in the first go round. Well, it's the sexton's wife. Later, that character morphs into Eve, but Mr. Vane is there for the first time visiting where they go take him down, and the sexton shows him the sleeping bodies that are being slowly transformed. But she says, he has not yet learned that the day begins with sleep. Tell him he must rest before he can do anything. And in particular, I was curious, whatever you have to say on that, but also it strikes me that probably there's a connection there with the work that you're doing at Windstone and the seasons and the patterns right, of agriculture and resting the land, etc. But please speak to that.
Yeah, and letting the land die, if you will. And Seaboard Parish MacDonald, in one of the sermons that's given in that novel, he talks a lot about death to self, and he talks about how each sleep is a little death, that every morning we are resurrected anew. And that is true for us as it is for the flowers or the seeds. And yeah, this is a story in which we see Vane running around and doing. And he does, like we said with the little ones, like he doesn't have either the courage or the wisdom, sometimes one, sometimes the other, sometimes both, to stop and listen and learn to listen fully to the stories of others, to get to know others, to develop relationship before he's trying to fix them. He doesn't take time. How often do we do that in ministry, right? We don't do the Paul thing in Athens where he spends a lot of time there before he gives the sermon. We pop in, let me tell you how to fix your life. And Vane does the same thing, and his actions would be so different. The story would be a lot shorter if he's
right.
to know the little ones or others first, and to wait on the Lord. He essentially, that's what he is unable to do. He can't take the time to die to self so that he can be equipped to do wisely, to act wisely.
Yeah.
And relationship takes time. Knowing stories are relationship. Knowing stories take time, and sometimes a long time. And we have to stop and rest and contemplate to learn from that. We stop and play. Which said MacDonald, that's such a big deal. Do you have time not just to rest, but to play? And it's in the playing and resting that we process and learn, develop relationship further, but also the wisdom grows in that time. And Vane takes the entire book to learn to do that. And he's not ready to stop. He hasn't learned that he has to sleep before he can do. He has to rest before he can do.
Well, Vane took a book. It's taken me 50 years, and I don't know that I've still gotten a handle on that. So he's doing all right.
Struggle too.
I think I'll just leave it to you. Just a few minutes. Any final thoughts or anything in particular we didn't address that you think is pivotal to understanding the text?
It is such a rich text with so much in it. But I think, the most central part of the text is relationship. I think there's been allusions to this here, and you'll definitely get a sense of this the more you spend time with the text, that MacDonald believed in the words of the prophets, in the communion of saints, in the cloud of witnesses through the ages whose stories we are called to steward. We're called to know the stories, we're called to steward the stories, not by preservation and dusty library. Vane's got all the books sitting on the library shelf.
Right.
But he and his dad and his grandpa have forgotten to read them, right?
Yeah.
So it's in continued living conversation with the books and praxis of what is in the text. MacDonald's repeatedly explaining his entire writing career that a book draws the reader into a world envisioned by another in order that we, the reader, might be better prepared for having been in relationship with the communications of that author and the characters of the author's story, to then venture out more equipped to engage with the complexity of God's cosmos of relationship. Back to a book is a door in, and therefore a door out. So for MacDonald, it's a fundamental truth that not only is it not good for man to be alone, it's actually impossible. So how do we do it well? Isolation impedes revelation.
Perfect.
As both Dante and Vane discover. And so he's trying to teach us. He believes that's the role of the teacher and the writer, to teach people of that. And Yeah, maybe just to sum up with that sentence, that he longs for his readers, for us and his friends, his active community, to never forget that it is to have read in vain if every human is not greater than any book. It is not more wonderful to understand than to love, is the quotation.
That's perfect. Oh, Kirstin, I am just thrilled. I'm so grateful for your time and for all your work over these many years and how freely you've shared it with us today. So thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you very much. Thank you for your encouragement. It means a lot to me. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody else and sharing this with people.
Thank you.
Thank you for the work you're doing.
All right. Thanks. See ya. Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word liminal. 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 Liminal is an adjective that means of, relating to, or situated at a sensory threshold, barely perceptible or capable of eliciting a response. It also means of, relating to, or being an intermediate state, phase, or condition, in between, transitional, often referred to as the liminal state between life and death. Liminal is like a place in between places. And so you might find yourself in a liminal state from time to time, and it can be very disorienting. I want to encourage you, if you find yourself in a liminal state, be at peace. For before you know it, the new state of being will present itself. And the less you stress about being in a liminal state, the more likely you are to find peace in the new state. Thank you, Liminal, for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.